Hello, and welcome on over to episode 166 on the Everyday Joy podcast. This week, a brand new guest, Adam, joins me, and there's a great picture of him and his wife over on the Everyday Joy Facebook community. If you want to give him a welcome, if you want to discuss or unpack things further, that is the place to go. I really do love seeing so many community members feeling like they can take ownership in a way of this community space, sharing what's going on in their lives. And I just want to point out something really poignant that Colin posted on the community page. He said, "People don't fake depression, they fake being okay. Remember that and be kind." Thank you so much, Colin, for just sharing that. I think it's something we all need to remember and often be reminded of. And if you are going through that difficult space, I hope that today's episode encourages you, but also that you know that there's so many places where you can get help. It all starts with taking that first step. Take the help that's available to you. Reach out to a friend or family member. Call a helpline, do what you need to do to take that next step. So, keeping all of that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the context of today's verse before we dive into it. This verse is written by a man named Paul, who wrote a lot of the New Testament. He really knew his stuff. He understood the context of the time. He understood what the Messiah was meant to look and sound like. But that also meant that when Jesus came, he was against him because according to his beliefs and what he had read and understood, no, this was not the Messiah he was waiting for, to the point where he was responsible for the murders of a lot of new Christians at the time. So he quite literally had blood on his hands. He had a pretty radical transformation story. And then following that, he endured a lot. He was imprisoned. He was beaten. He was hungry. He was then welcomed. He was then celebrated. Oh my goodness, this man experienced so many highs and so many lows. So that's a little bit of the background to today's Bible verse and who penned these words. Let's get into it.
I know what it is to be poor or to have plenty, and I have lived under all kinds of conditions. I know what it means to be full or to be hungry, to have much or too little. Jesus gives me the strength to face anything. That's from Philippians 4, verses 12 to 13 from the Contemporary English Version.
I have got Adam here in studio with me once again. Hello, Adam.
Hey, Joy. Thanks for having me back.
It's been really great hearing your perspective. I think one of the things I've really appreciated about our hallway conversations is I just learn something new about you every single time. You're a farmer.
Well, horticulture, but it's a type of farming, so close enough.
So break that down for me. What is
horticulture? Yeah, so horticulture, so growing plants, so pot plants.
Yeah.
Right. So for 15 years, I spent growing proteas specifically, so South African proteas. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know they were South African.
Yep.
I thought they were.
There are some Australian ones, but majority of them are South African.
Wow. Well, and now you do hardcore technical work. Yep. I feel like, plants and technology. Do you find that the skills are kind of transferable, your horticultural skills over into IT?
There's definitely some. The watering doesn't work quite so well in IT though. Like IT and water doesn't work quite so good.
Yeah, I feel that would be a little bit of an issue. Glad you don't do that around the studio. So today we're taking a look at Philippians 4, verses 12 to 13. When I look at this verse, Adam, I see someone who has actually been through the highs and the lows of life, and I think that adds credibility to what he has to say. I think if he had a sweet life and right at the end he said, Jesus gives me the strength to face anything, I think it would sound a bit empty, I think, because it's like, well, you haven't experienced difficult things. So I think my encouragement is when someone who's gone through the real tough stuff in life, and when I hear them say, but Jesus, it just carries a weight to it. And I'm so glad that Paul, after all the highs and lows and difficulties that he went through, that he penned this verse. And I think it means so much more because he has the credibility to say those things. Yeah. That's my first impression. What about you?
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And particularly I think about is someone like Paul that was so close to following God, right? He had some major things in his life, so he was imprisoned multiple times. He was stoned, shipwrecked, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Like, he was shipwrecked.
You'd think he would stop getting on boats after the second time.
So, like, he absolutely knows what it's like to live in the highs and definitely the lows, for sure.
And what does this verse tell you about who God is or what matters to him?
Yeah, to me, look, it tells me that God is like right beside us with every step that we take, which is such an encouraging thing. And it also tells me that when things like go beyond what we think we can, in the natural kind of what we can bear, what we can take, that God is there with us and he wants us to rely on him to help us get through those really difficult times.
That he is right there with us. I think, that's absolutely the heart of this verse for me as well. So going to, I think, my favourite question that I get to ask on this podcast. Do you have a story, Adam, in your life where this verse applied?
Yeah, absolutely we do. I talked about my kids an episode or 2 back.
Yes.
So all 3 of my kids are actually on the autism spectrum.
Wow.
Which brings some challenges with raising kids. But if we go back to when they were first kind of diagnosed, the journey through that was quite challenging. You're seeing your kids and you're seeing them not quite do the same things that other kids are doing, or reacting in different ways, or different behaviours that you just kind of think, oh, is that a stage, or what's going on there? And eventually you kind of end up at the point where you go, okay, we need to seek some professional advice here, and to work through that point and to hear that decision, that diagnosis of they're on the autism spectrum. As a parent, that's a difficult thing. You kind of go through a bit of this like grieving kind of process a little, in a way, because what you thought you were going to have with these kids is now like totally swung around and it's totally on its head. So it's often difficult. Every stage of life with them brings another challenge.
Yeah. And so how old were the kids when they were all diagnosed?
It ranged. So our oldest was diagnosed quite early, so he was like 18 months old when we first started noticing those kind of things. And then my daughter, she was a little bit older, but around the kind of 5 or 6 age.
And I guess that would have been not only challenging for the kids themselves, but also for you as parents, and probably extended out into, I suppose, the grandparents and the uncles and aunties. It really does, I think, like this verse talks about, it takes you from a high to a low. And the grief, I'm so glad you touched on that. I don't think people talk enough about the grief of lost dreams or lost expectations.
And that's absolutely what it is. And it took us a while to kind of think through and go, why is this so upsetting? It's because you have kind of these, as a parent, you have these thoughts and these plans and these dreams for your kids, and all of a sudden that's like, hey, they're not going to be a normal kid, and we don't like the word normal, but the things that people will progressively do, it's going to be more challenging for them. And so there's absolutely a grieving process that happens there.
Yeah. And so in that space, how did this particular verse come alive for you guys?
The way that verse came alive for us was really around the fact that we knew that this was like beyond us. In our own strength, there was no way we were going to be able to do this. And as I said before, every stage brings another challenge along with it. And often we would find ourselves at the end of our rope because you're trying to do things and it's just so much more harder. But when I sit back and we look at this verse, Jesus refreshes and energizes. Like when we're at the end of our rope, he's there to energize us, to refresh us, and to actually comfort us through those times. And you just got to give it to Jesus and say, I can't do it, I need your help. And then he comes through.
Yeah. And I guess there was the initial moment of the diagnosis and journeying through that, and again with each child. And today you've still got all 3 kids at home with you, and so I'm guessing every single day is different. They've all got their own journeys, I suppose, with schoolwork and then their friends and all those sorts of things. So I know as a fact there's a mum who listens and she's got 4 children on the autism spectrum, and she only found out that she herself was also autistic as her children were getting diagnosed. So she's processing herself and she's processing her children, and that's such a common thing. We actually did a talk topic on this with the Everyday Joy Hour about parents realising they themselves actually have struggled with this when their children got diagnosed. All that to say is that there's so much to it. There's layers and layers of understanding and grief and discovery, and you're kind of back to that. In the day-to-day, how do you just take that deep breath and love on your children?
I think you really got to acknowledge the fact that it does get hard. and that you don't always have all of the answers, and that's totally okay, because it's not a normal process. It's not a normal parenting process. There's things you're going to hit and you're just going to go, I've got no idea. But by reacting instinctively out of, well, this is what should happen, you just got to stop and slow down and remember that they just think a bit different. I've got to teach them a bit differently. It doesn't mean they can't, it just means it's harder for them. So just by taking our time and thinking it through and slowing down really helps us get there.
Yeah. And what would be, just to wrap up today's conversation, what would be your encouragement maybe to someone listening who maybe isn't the parent, but they are the child?
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of young adults listening as well, and a lot of children actually, teenagers listening to this podcast. And maybe they themselves, I can't put myself in their shoes, but I suppose there would be a bit of frustration within themselves that they can't achieve what they want to achieve, or maybe frustration at other people around them and the sacrifices they've had to make in order to look after them. What would you say to someone listening who has had some sort of neurodiverse diagnosis and they're sitting in a frustrated space?
Yeah, sure. Again, I think you got to acknowledge it's going to be frustrating. It's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to get upset by it. But I think the most important thing is that when you do get to that end of your rope and you're like, I don't get it, I can't do it, I'm frustrated, it's too hard. It's about remembering this verse and just remembering that, Jesus gives me the strength to face anything. While it might be hard, it might be tough, Jesus is there with you and he's going to help you through it.
As we come to the end of today's episode, I know that there are so many hopeful moments you can take away from this, but one of the things I do want to focus on today is this idea of neurodivergence, and a lot of people realizing that they themselves are different as a result of their children getting diagnosed. On the Everyday Joy Hour live talk show we do based on this, one of the conversations we had a few weeks ago was around the idea of something you learnt later on in life. And the conversation was really just headed by a lot of individuals calling in saying, it took me 50, 60, 70 years before I got a diagnosis. And all of a sudden, I realized why it was so hard for me to make friends, why everyone else just seemed to understand certain things, why I always struggled with A, B, C, and D. And so as they themselves are processing and dealing with this, oftentimes at the same time, they're journeying through that same thing with their children. It's such a powerful conversation, and I guess what I really want to say is that you are not alone. I'd encourage you to head on over to the Everyday Joy Facebook community, because the question I'm going to ask on the Facebook page is this: tell me about a time in your life where you as a neurodivergent person found hope and encouragement. So if that is that for you, go ahead, find it there. We're going to have a conversation over on the Facebook page, because it's important that we talk about this. Now, for those of us who don't walk that journey, know that there are so many around us who are, and to have that kindness, to have that compassion, to have that patience that Adam talked about doesn't mean it's not impossible. It just means it might take a little bit of extra effort and time to get there. And goodness me, we have the greatest example in Jesus, who has all the patience and all the strategy and all the love and grace in the world for us when we need that in our lives. And what a great way that we can reflect the love of Jesus by showing that same compassion and love and patience to those around us. Before we wrap up today's episode, I want to do a massive shout out to Christian Jobs Australia, and you can find their website in the description below. They've supported episode 166, and I think it ties in so well with today's conversation. Maybe for you haven't quite found the right place for you to work because you haven't checked out their job board. What have you got to lose? Go check it out, christianjobs.com.au. Hey, look forward to catching up again tomorrow right here on the Everyday Joy podcast.